Lucas Hayes was a construction worker known for his steady hands and quiet demeanor. At 34, he had spent over a decade building homes, repairing roofs, and occasionally fixing fences when his clients couldn't afford a full replacement. His life was simple, almost painfully so. Each day, he left his tiny apartment in Cedar Ridge, a small town where everybody knew everybody, and walked to the construction site. Work kept him grounded, though it didn't leave him with much in the way of savings or time. He lived paycheck to paycheck, scraping by, but always kept a small smile for anyone who crossed his path. One brisk autumn morning, Lucas stood at the edge of the diner parking lot, sipping coffee from a dented thermos while waiting for his crew to arrive. Across the street, an elderly woman in a faded blue cardigan shuffled down her porch steps. Her movements were cautious, and the wobble of the wooden rail she clung to made Lucas instinctively wince. As she made her way to the mailbox, the entire porch groaned with each step, its planks warped and splintered from years of neglect. Lucas had seen the woman before, Mrs. Evelyn Carter. She had lived in the same small yellow house for decades, a widow who was always quick to greet neighbors with a warm smile but seldom asked for help. Her late husband, Gerald, had been a handyman, known for fixing things around town, but since his passing 5 years ago, Evelyn's house had started showing its age. That morning, as Lucas observed her struggle, something stirred in him. He knew enough about construction to recognize the signs of a porch on the brink of collapse. It wasn't just the railing that was failing, the entire structure seemed dangerously unstable. Lucas thought about offering help but hesitated. Money was tight, and he couldn't afford to work for free. Still, the image of Evelyn lingered with him throughout the day. At lunch, he brought it up to his crew. "Hey," he began, tapping his sandwich wrapper against the table, "you know Mrs. Carter over on Maple Street? Her porch is falling apart." One of his co-workers, Sam, raised an eyebrow. "You think she's gonna pay someone to fix it?" "Last I heard, she's barely making it on her late husband's pension." Lucas nodded. "I know. It's just if that thing gives out while she's walking on it," he let the sentence hang. He didn't need to finish. They all knew what could happen. Another worker, Pete, shrugged. "Unless you're offering to fix it for free, I don't see what you can do. Times are tough for everyone, man." The rest of the day, Lucas wrestled with the idea. By the time he clocked out and trudged home, the decision was made. He would help Mrs. Carter rebuild her porch, whether she could afford it or not. The next morning, Lucas knocked on her door. Evelyn answered, her gentle face wrinkled in surprise. "Well, good morning, Lucas. What brings you by?" she asked, her voice carrying the warmth of someone unaccustomed to visitors. "I couldn't help noticing your porch," Lucas said, gesturing toward the sagging steps. "It's looking a little rough. I was wondering if I could fix it up for you." Evelyn's smile faltered. She glanced down at her porch, then back at Lucas. "Oh, I know it's bad. Gerald built it years ago, and I've tried to keep it up, but I'm afraid my hands aren't what they used to be." She hesitated. "I don't think I could afford something like that right now, though. But thank you for offering." Lucas scratched the back of his neck. "I wasn't thinking about payment, Ma. I am. I've got some spare lumber and tools from an old project. I'd be happy to take care of it." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, though she quickly blinked them away. "That's awfully kind of you, Lucas. Are you sure? I wouldn't want to impose." Lucas nodded firmly. "It's no trouble. Besides, it'll give me something to do on my days off." And so, the project began. Every Saturday morning, Lucas arrived with his toolbox and a thermos of coffee, ready to work. Evelyn insisted on making him breakfast each time, claiming it was the least she could do. Over eggs and toast, they talked about the town, her late husband, and Lucas's dreams of one day starting his own construction company. At first, the work was slow. The porch was in worse shape than Lucas had realized. He had to tear out the old wood completely, which turned into a bigger job than anticipated. To make matters worse, his spare lumber didn't stretch as far as he hoped, and by the second weekend, he found himself digging into his own wallet to buy supplies. I'll pay you back, Lucas Evelyn promised, watching him measure a new plank. It might take me a while, but I will. Lucas waved her off. It's not about that. I just want to make sure it's safe for you. Weeks passed, and the porch slowly came to life, sturdy and polished. As Lucas worked, neighbors began to notice. Some stopped by to offer coffee or admire his craftsmanship. Others offered to help, though few actually followed through. It didn't bother Lucas. He enjoyed the quiet satisfaction of the work and the time spent with Evelyn, who treated him like family. Yet beneath his resolve, Lucas was struggling. Between his regular job and the porch project, he was exhausted. His bank account had dwindled to almost nothing, and bills loomed large. He tried not to think about it, focusing instead on finishing the job. But late at night, as he lay in bed, doubt crept in. Was he doing the right thing? Could he really afford this kind of generosity? By the end of the 5th week, the porch was nearly complete. The once shaky steps were now solid, the railing firm, and the deck painted a cheerful shade of white. Evelyn couldn't stop smiling as she admired the transformation. It's beautiful, Lucas. You've done so much for me. I can't thank you enough. Lucas smiled, though weariness tugged at his features. Just glad it's done. You deserve it, Mrs. Carter. As Lucas packed up his tools that evening, Evelyn watched him from the doorway, a thoughtful look on her face. You know, she said softly, kindness like yours doesn't go unnoticed. I've got a little something for you, nothing big, but it's the least I can do. Lucas shook his head. You don't owe me anything, really. But Evelyn insisted, disappearing inside for a moment before returning with a small envelope. Please, take it. Lucas hesitated, then accepted it with a nod of gratitude. As he walked home under the fading light, he slipped the envelope into his pocket, not realizing that what Evelyn had given him would soon change his life forever. The next morning, Lucas sat at his tiny kitchen table, the envelope Evelyn had given him still unopened beside his coffee cup. He had assumed it was a simple thank you card, or maybe a small donation toward the materials he'd bought for the porch. Whatever it was, he didn't expect much. Evelyn didn't have much to give. Finally, curiosity got the better of him. He tore open the envelope, finding a folded piece of stationery inside. At the top, in neat cursive handwriting, were the words, "To Lucas with gratitude." Beneath them, Evelyn had written, "Dear Lucas, words cannot express how much your kindness has meant to me. In a world that often feels cold and rushed, you have reminded me of the goodness that still exists in people. You've done more than rebuild my porch, you've restored my faith in the simple power of compassion. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. With gratitude, Evelyn Carter." Lucas smiled at the heartfelt note, but something else fell out of the envelope, a small folded check. When he opened it, his eyes widened. The amount was far more than he expected, $500. He almost dropped it in shock. For Evelyn, this was no small sum. It was an act of sacrifice. Lucas folded the check back into the envelope, a lump forming in his throat. He couldn't possibly accept it. Evelyn needed that money far more than he did. Later that day, he walked back to Evelyn's house, the check and note tucked in his pocket. She answered the door with her usual warm smile, her hands dusted with flour from baking. "Lucas, what brings you by?" "I can't take this," Lucas said, holding out the envelope. "This is way too much, Evelyn. I can't accept it." Evelyn shook her head and gently pushed the envelope back toward him. "It's not too much, Lucas. It's what you deserve." "But..." "Lucas," she interrupted, her voice firm but kind. "You gave me something priceless. I feel safe in my own home again because of you. I wanted to give back, even just a little. Please let me do this." Reluctantly, Lucas nodded, though the check stayed in his pocket. He wasn't sure what to do with it yet, but he decided not to argue further. In the weeks that followed, Lucas noticed something remarkable. word of his kindness to Evelyn had spread through town. Neighbors began stopping him on the street, thanking him for what he'd done. Some even approached him with requests for small projects, fixing a fence here, patching a roof there. At first, he was hesitant. He didn't want to charge Evelyn's neighbors for work they might not be able to afford. But many insisted on paying him, and soon he found himself taking on more jobs than ever before. To his surprise, these smaller, more personal projects began to fill a gap in his heart that he hadn't realized existed. For years, construction had been just a job, a way to pay the bills. But now it felt like something more. It felt like a calling. One day, as Lucas was finishing repairs on a neighbor's broken gate, a man in a crisp suit approached him. "Are you Lucas Hayes?" the man asked, extending a hand. Lucas wiped his own hand on his jeans before shaking it. "That's me. Can I help you?" The man smiled. "My name's Alan Turner. I run a small real estate company in Cedar Ridge, and I've heard a lot about your work. I've got a few properties that need repairs before they go on the market. I was wondering if you'd be interested in taking on the jobs. I can pay you fairly, of course." Lucas was stunned. He had never been sought out for work before, let alone by someone in real estate. "I'd be happy to help," he said, trying to keep the excitement from his voice. Over the next few weeks, Lucas worked tirelessly on Alan's properties, repairing floors, painting walls, and restoring old fixtures. The pay was steady and better than anything he had earned before. For the first time in years, he managed to pay off some lingering bills and even set aside a little savings. But despite his growing workload, Lucas never forgot Evelyn. He visited her often, sometimes just to share a cup of coffee and chat. She remained a source of encouragement, always quick to remind him of the good he was doing. One sunny afternoon, Evelyn handed Lucas an old photo album. "Take a look," she said, her eyes twinkling. "I thought you might like to see Gerald's work." Lucas flipped through the pages, marveling at the photos of beautifully crafted furniture, handmade cabinets, and intricate woodwork. He was talented, Lucas said, admiration in his voice. He was, Evelyn agreed. "And so are you. You remind me of him in a lot of ways. He always believed that helping others was the best kind of work there was." Her words stayed with Lucas long after he left that day. For the first time, he began to think about what kind of legacy he wanted to leave behind. He had always been content to take life one day at a time. But now, he wondered if there was something more he could strive for. One evening, as Lucas sat in his apartment, sketching plans for his next job, he noticed the envelope from Evelyn still sitting on the counter. He had never cashed the check. Instead, an idea began to take shape in his mind, one that would honor Evelyn's kindness and Gerald's legacy. He decided to take a leap of faith. Lucas's idea began as a quiet thought, one he wasn't sure he could pull off. But the more he dwelled on it, the more it felt right. He wanted to do something meaningful, something that could grow beyond just helping one neighbor at a time. Lucas decided to start his own small business, focused on affordable repairs and restorations for those who couldn't normally afford them. It would be his way of paying forward the kindness and trust Evelyn had shown him. But starting a business was no small feat. Lucas had no savings to speak of, no business background, and only a basic understanding of what running a company required. Yet, he was determined. The check from Evelyn became his seed money, a symbolic starting point for the journey ahead. The first step was finding a way to spread the word. He began by creating simple flyers on his old laptop, using free templates to design them. He called his new venture Helping Hands Repairs and wrote a tagline: affordable, reliable repairs by your neighbor. He spent his evenings walking through town, tacking the flyers onto bulletin boards at the grocery store, coffee shop, and post office. To his surprise, the response was immediate. Calls started coming in, mostly from elderly residents like Evelyn who needed small repairs: a leaky faucet here, a creaky door there. Lucas took on every job with the same care and attention he'd given to Evelyn's porch, often charging little or nothing for those who clearly couldn't afford to pay. His phone didn't stop ringing. One day, as he was fixing a wobbly kitchen cabinet for a retired schoolteacher, The woman handed him an envelope similar to the one Evelyn had given him. "Take this," she said firmly. "It's not much, but you've been a godsend." Lucas opened the envelope when he got home and found $50 inside, along with a handwritten note that read, "Thank you for making my home feel safe again." The gesture reminded him of Evelyn, and it strengthened his resolve to keep going. As the weeks passed, the jobs grew larger and more varied. Word of mouth spread quickly in Cedar Ridge, and soon Lucas found himself with more work than he could handle alone. That's when he approached his old co-workers, Sam and Pete. "I've started something new," Lucas explained over coffee at the diner. "Helping Hands Repairs. It's been going great, but I could use some help. If you're interested, I'd love to bring you both on board." Sam leaned back in his chair, skeptical. "You really think this can work? A repair business that barely charges people? Sounds like a fast way to go broke." Pete nodded in agreement. "Yeah man, we've got bills to pay too. No offense, but this sounds risky." Lucas smiled. "I thought the same thing at first, but people are more generous than you think. I've had plenty of customers who insisted on paying, even if they didn't have to. And I've learned something: helping people doesn't just make them feel good. It makes you feel good too." After some hesitation, Sam and Pete agreed to give it a try. Lucas used part of his earnings to buy them basic tools, and the three of them began tackling jobs together. With their combined skills, they were able to take on larger projects, like rebuilding fences, installing ramps for wheelchair users, and repairing roofs damaged in storms. One afternoon, Lucas received a call from Alan Turner, the real estate agent who had first hired him for property repairs. "Lucas," Alan said, "I've got a big project for you. There's an old community center on the edge of town that's been sitting empty for years. The town council wants to restore it, but their budget is tight. I told them about you, and they're interested in hearing your ideas." The idea of restoring an entire community center was daunting, but Lucas couldn't resist the challenge. He and his crew met with the town council the following week, walking through the rundown building and discussing what could be done. The place was in rough shape: peeling paint, broken windows, and a sagging roof, but Lucas could see its potential. "We'll do it," Lucas said, after consulting with Sam and Pete. "We'll work within your budget and make it something the whole town can be proud of." The project became a turning point for Helping Hands Repairs. It wasn't just about the physical work, it was about bringing people together. Volunteers from across Cedar Ridge pitched in, painting walls, planting flowers outside, and donating furniture for the center's reopening. Lucas even reached out to Evelyn, who baked cookies for the workers every Saturday. By the time the community center was finished, it had become a symbol of what Lucas had hoped to achieve: a place where neighbors could come together, regardless of their circumstances, to help and support one another. On the day of the grand reopening, the entire town gathered to celebrate. Lucas stood in the middle of the crowd, humbled by the sight of people laughing, sharing stories, and marveling at the transformation of the once abandoned building. Evelyn was there too, seated on a bench near the entrance, her hands clasped together in quiet pride. "You've done something wonderful, Lucas," she said when he came over to sit beside her. "Gerald would have been so proud of you." Lucas looked out at the crowd, his heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you, Evelyn. You started all of this." Evelyn smiled softly. "No, Lucas. You had it in you all along. I just gave you a little nudge." For the first time in years, Lucas felt like his life had real purpose. Helping Hands Repairs wasn't just a business, it was a way of making the world a little brighter, one project at a time. Lucas sat in Evelyn's living room, the photo album still on his lap. Her stories of Gerald's kindness and craftsmanship had ignited something in him, a desire to do more, to leave a mark of his own. Evelyn, ever perceptive, noticed the faraway look in his eyes. "You're cooking up something, aren't you?" she asked with a knowing smile. Lucas chuckled. "Maybe. I've been thinking about starting something new, something that could help more people like you." Evelyn reached out and patted his hand. Gerald always said that the best kind of work doesn't just fix things, it builds people up. Whatever you do, Lucas, I know it'll be something special. Her words solidified his resolve. That evening, back at his apartment, Lucas finally made a decision. He withdrew the $500 Evelyn had given him and used it to register a small business. He called it Hayes Helping Hands, a name that reflected both his craft and the heart behind it. His mission was clear: to combine paying jobs with pro bono work for those in need. At first, it was a struggle. Balancing bills, client projects, and volunteer repairs stretched Lucas thin. But the community rallied around him. Alan Turner became his first major client, sending a steady stream of real estate jobs his way. Evelyn, too, played her part, spreading the word about Lucas's generosity to anyone who would listen. Soon neighbors began donating spare materials, tools, and even their time to help Lucas on his free projects. One particularly cold morning, as Lucas worked on repairing a roof for a single mother with 2 young children, he realized how far he had come. The woman watched from the yard, tears streaming down her face as her kids played safely nearby. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "This means the world to us." Lucas smiled and wiped the sweat from his brow. "You just did," he replied. Months later, Lucas returned to Evelyn's house for their now regular coffee chats. This time, he brought her a surprise: a handmade bench, crafted from the leftover wood he had used to rebuild her porch. "I thought you could use a comfortable spot to enjoy the mornings," he said, setting it down on the porch with a grin. Evelyn's eyes shimmered with tears as she ran her hands over the smooth, polished wood. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Gerald would have loved this." Lucas sat beside her on the bench, the two of them watching the autumn leaves drift down onto the freshly rebuilt porch. "You know," Evelyn said after a long pause, "you've changed more lives than you realize, not just with your work, but with the way you make people believe in kindness again." Lucas looked down, humbled by her words. "I couldn't have done any of this without you. That check you gave me, it started everything." Evelyn smiled, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't give you that check to start something, Lucas. I gave it because you already had everything you needed to make a difference. All you had to do was believe in yourself." The words stayed with Lucas as he left Evelyn's house that evening. His small business had begun to thrive, but more than that, he felt a sense of purpose he had never known before. He was no longer just a construction worker scraping by, he was a builder of hope, one porch, one roof, one home at a time. Years later, Hayes Helping Hands became a cornerstone of the Cedar Ridge community. Lucas hired and trained others, teaching them not just the skills of the trade but the importance of compassion. Evelyn, now in her 90s, remained his biggest cheerleader, sitting proudly on her porch bench as neighbors gathered to share stories of how Lucas had changed their lives. And though Lucas's journey had started with one small act of kindness, he learned that it was the ripples of that act, the connections forged, the hope restored that truly made a lasting impact. For Lucas, the greatest reward wasn't the success of his business or the praise he received. It was the knowledge that, like Evelyn had said, he had built people up in the process. As he stood on Evelyn's porch one sunny afternoon, sipping coffee and watching her smile at the children playing in the yard, Lucas felt a quiet joy settle in his heart. He had found his place in the world, not by chasing wealth or recognition, but by following a simple truth: when you lift others, you lift yourself. And that made all the difference.